There may be some justice bills still coming for Committee of the Whole House and third reading, or the Minister of Justice will have the opportunity to be able to answer some of the concerns I've raised. If I'm not mistaken, there's at least one more bill for second reading that the Minister or the Government House Leader appears reluctant to call for debate, but I'm still looking forward to the opportunity to make a few remarks on the Summary Proceedings Act, which hopefully we'll have the opportunity to do before very long. But, Mr. Speaker, having had this opportunity to say a few words on the title of Bill 103, I'd like to say I look forward to debate on the clauses of Bill 103, but that would be misleading the House, because saying clauses would assume there's more than one. And as I pointed out, Mr. Speaker, this bill actually has one clause. It takes up about a quarter of a page and is a total of 16 words. So to go in the clause-by-clause debate apparently is not going to happen on Bill number 103. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to have made a few remarks on this, and I certainly look forward to the discussion that will continue to take place on Bill 103 here in the Committee of the Whole House.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I rise in my place to provide some framework around the questions that were asked earlier. One of the practices that
the Chair recognizes the Honourable Member from Cape Breton South on a point of order.
Mr. Chair, the Deputy Government House Leader said earlier that we have question period at 2 o'clock. The Premier is here, and I'm wondering, are we going to? We were supposed to adjourn the debate on this issue at 2 p.m. for question period. So I'm just wondering whether we're going to follow that, or whether we're going to allow additional speakers in this bill.
To the best of my knowledge, we're going to continue. There he is. We'll ask him. The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader, the question that has been asked as to whether we are going to revert now to question period, or are we going to continue on the bill?
No, the clerk could report progress to the House.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do then is we're going to revert to what was agreed to earlier. The Minister will be the first one to respond when we go back into the Committee of the Whole House. Okay, the motion is carried. The committee will now rise and report its business to the House.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on Bills reports
that the committee has met, has made considerable progress, and begs leave to sit again.
Thank you. Before we go to question period, I'm going to recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the members of the House to put their attention to the West Gallery. Today in the West Gallery we have members from the Prince Andrew High in Dartmouth who are in my colleagues Dartmouth North's, or Dartmouth East, I'm sorry, Dartmouth East's constituency. We have members, 28 members of grade 11 and 12 from the political science class. And last week I had the opportunity to be invited to that class and say a few words, thanks to my cousin Courtney McKenzie, who will now be very upset with me. And with them today is their teachers, Tim Hallman and Marie Karamis. And I apologize if I said that wrong. So if you could join together and giving them a warm welcome here in the House, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. We certainly welcome all our visitors here this afternoon to the House of Assembly, and hope they enjoy the proceedings here in our legislature. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is 2:05, and we'll go to 3:05, and I'll recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is sending the signal to business in this province and business beyond our borders. We have an uncompetitive, punitive tax regime for business. And now this NDP government is sending a dangerous signal to business in Nova Scotia that are not unionized or any business which may be considering coming here. Yesterday, the Premier confirmed in this House it is his government's intent to open up labour laws and refuse to rule out eliminating the provision for secret ballots and union certification. So my question to the Premier, have union leaders told you that eliminating secret ballot for certification is a way around the Michelin bill?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I said no such thing. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, and specifically, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it absolutely clear that so far as I'm concerned, there is absolutely nothing that this government would do that would any way impinge upon the industrial relation stability in this province. And I have said point blank, the reason why you have a Labour Relations Committee, which these guys apparently are opposed to, is so that you don't have the kind of things that happened when the Labour Standards Act came forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Committee that leaves out non-unionized employers across this province for one reason, and that's to make union leaders happy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, neither the Premier nor this government will state their true intentions. They could do so, put the minds of business owners and workers at ease, but Mr. Speaker, they are silent. But their past history tells a different story. Twice in opposition, the member from Cape Breton Centre introduced legislation calling for the elimination of secret ballots when it comes to building unions, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, do you think making union certification easier is going to help grow the economy of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be crystal clear about this. We have absolutely no intention of bringing forward any legislation that will interfere with the secret ballot process.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to that point, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has already done that. And as a matter of fact, yesterday he confirmed that in this House. He should read what he said. Economic growth is essential to the prosperity of this province. Our businesses need to compete on a level playing field with their nearest neighbours. Inflicting changes to labour laws without the input from a majority of business and workers in this province is unfair and, frankly, Mr. Speaker, undemocratic. The Premier and his Minister of Labour have confirmed its government's intent to open up the Trade Union Act. My question to the Premier is, what is your true intention in opening up the Trade Union Act?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is the problem of asking a question or after you've already gotten the answer and not having anything else to ask, Mr. Speaker. We've said repeatedly that the purpose of having a good labour relations in this province and having the kind of consultation mechanism that doesn't now exist is exactly what is necessary for good labour relations in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. I appreciate that a moment ago he indicated that there would be no legislation coming forward regarding union drives and membership cards and so on, but the fact of the matter is that in September of this year, his cabinet approved some far-reaching pro-union regulations on this very topic, known as the Trade Union Procedures Regulations, that deal with things like the definition of union membership, among other things. These regulations were passed without any public consultation. Another change, Mr. Speaker, that was slipped through in the hopes that no one would notice. And so my question to the Premier, to be fair, who did the Premier's office, the Department of Labour and Workplace Development, or the Premier himself consult with prior to approving those regulations, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all I can say about that is that there are housekeeping regulations that come forward all the time, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier clearly has a very broad definition of housekeeping, that is for sure. It should be a fundamental principle of government that no new regulations of this nature be passed in such a manner without a thorough understanding of their impact on our economy and the ability of our province to attract new investment and new jobs. And so my question to the Premier, did he ask experts at his disposal, whether at economic development, NSBI, or other economists, for their opinion on the impact on our economy of these new labour regulations and our ability to attract new business and new jobs to the province? Yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all the regulations that come through government have the benefit of the advice of the departments, of the various experts who are within government. Of course that happens.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the point. That without the benefit of public consultation, without even an examination of the economic impact of the decisions of this government, regulatory or otherwise, it gets to be pretty scary to wonder who they are consulting with. And so my question to the Premier is this: how many meetings with organized labour leaders were held by the Premier or by members of the Premier's office staff or the relevant department prior to enacting those regulations in September? And before he answers, I would just like to table a recent press release from the NSGEU, which clearly states that their president met with the Department of Labour and Workforce Development on June the 30th, prior to the release of the July discussion paper on this topic. And so I table that as the Premier answers the question, who was consulted with prior to those regulations?
Thank you. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we meet with business and union leaders across the province all the time, Mr. Speaker, because that's what a responsible government does.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is the deadline for school boards in the province to come up with 22% cuts to their organizations. It's all part of this government's plan to balance the budget by making others do their dirty work, Mr. Speaker. One of those is Vic Fleury, the president of the Nova Scotia School Boards Association and member of the Annapolis Valley Regional School Board. Mr. Speaker, and I want to give a direct quote from Mr. Fleury, and he says, going to a 20% cut is going to tear the guts out of public education, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, the Minister of Education is just calling it an exercise. So my question to the Premier, is this just an exercise, or are you really going to cut 22% of the public education system?
The Honourable Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it was the case in years gone by under both the other parties and governments where they made decisions, whether it was to roll back wages or to take away collective bargaining rights, and they did it by legislation. They never asked anybody.
Order.
They never talked.
Order. Order, please. Order. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
What we do, Mr. Speaker, by contrast, is actually go out to the organizations that make up 60% of the budget of this province and ask them for their advice and their leadership in making sure we get back to balance.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let me translate that for you. He goes to those organizations that make the decisions he doesn't have the backbone to make, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows the fear and the concerns and the uncertainty that he's instilling in parents and students with this little exercise, Mr. Speaker. The chair of the Cape Breton Victoria Regional School Board, Lauren Green, put it this way, and I'll quote, "If they follow through with these cuts, I think we pretty much turn the keys over to the province and let them run it." Mr. Speaker, that was after meeting with the school board on Monday night. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is Black Friday for school boards, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, is it your government's plan to take over the administration of schools in this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is astounding that the Leader of the Opposition would complain so vociferously and bitterly about the lack of consultation in one sector that he alleges, and yet when the government is going out of its way to ensure full and proper consultation with the very people who are going to be affected, he complains about that too.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in a response to my question about education in this House, the Premier said it is his intention to balance the budget. Let's review. So far, he has put $1.7 billion on the provincial debt in less than 18 months. He increased program spending 9% in year one, 7% in the second year. Mr. Speaker, he has spent more than $80 million buying land from Irving. He increased the industrial expansion fund by more than $200 million, which, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, is a slush fund for cabinet ministers. And now he wants the school board to do what he can't or won't do, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, is it your intention to balance the budget on the backs of our children? Explain to this House how that is helping us prepare for the future.
The Honourable Premier.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, every single thing that he has said there is false, and he knows it, Mr. Speaker, but he continues to say it. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we were left with almost a $1.4 billion hill to climb created by the former government, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, they made a mess. We're going to fix it.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday when asked what his plan for education was in this province, the Premier said, "Our real plan is to make sure that we get the books of this province back to balance." Really? Is that what you want to say? Are you sure you're good with that? You're good with that answer? It was rather a flip response. I would like to give the Premier another opportunity to ask the question. Mr. Premier, what is your plan for education in light of your minister's request to school boards for a 22% education cut?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the population of public schools in this province has fallen by some 30,000 students in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker, and yet funding has continued to increase at a far, far greater rate. What we have asked the school boards to do is to look not only at the program delivery, but more importantly, Mr. Speaker, to also look at the extraordinary cost increases in administration. And we expect, Mr. Speaker, that for them to have a look at it and to make sure we get this this province back to balance.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove in your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a number of members from this House attended an event at the Provincial Autism Centre last night. There we heard about the importance of funding for autism. My question is for the Premier, will he assure the parents of children with autism spectrum disorder that they will not see any decrease in funding from the province for autism programs in schools?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are going to keep the commitments we have made with respect to autism funding.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we are now hearing that targeted funding, the money that goes to boards for specific programs like math mentors, options and opportunities, autism programs, for example, may in fact be cut in this budgeting exercise. So what we would like is for the Premier to please tell these young people up in the gallery from Prince Andrew High School what programs he's going to cut to balance the budget.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we are handing over to the school boards the responsibility to look at the management of the budgets they are given. But, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. We are going to make sure...
Order. The Honourable Premier.
We are going to make sure that the administrative costs are kept under control, and we're going to make sure that money is taken out of the boardroom and put in the classroom.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. I was dismayed this morning to see the Premier quoted in the Halifax Herald as saying that people who oppose the pro-union direction of his government are being armed with wrong information, and I'll table that relevant article from this morning's paper, sir. When you consider that the people he is referring to include some of the leading employers of this province, including the 70% of private employers that are non-unionized and virtually every small business in the province, Mr. Speaker, it is an appalling statement. In fact, I was shocked and appalled by what the Premier said in the paper today. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a recent client update written by Stuart McKelvey, a very prominent and well-respected law firm in Nova Scotia. In fact, I believe it's the firm that previously employed the member to the Premier's right. Mr. Speaker, this is a client update that they sent to their hundreds of clients around the province, alerting them to the dangers of this government's pro-union agenda. And so my question to the Premier, will he now admit that Nova Scotians are right to be concerned about his government's recently uncovered union agenda, or is Stuart McKelvey wrong? That is my question.
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he may only have been here a little while, but he sure has got the rhetoric down. Mr. Speaker, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that I stand by exactly what I said yesterday. I believe that people were given wrong information about the intent and the result of this legislation. This is good legislation. It is good for labour relations in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, all of this begs the question, who is the Premier really listening to on these matters? And so I would like to table one more document, which is a recent news release from the National Union of Public and General Employees. And I'll quote from it as follows. It says, following through on commitments made during the recent civil service negotiations, the Government of Nova Scotia is moving to do the following, and then it lists a variety of commitments made by that government over there to this group here, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, what other commitments have you made to union leaders that Nova Scotians will end up paying the price for?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of commitments to union leaders, I'd like to read this one. In the event that specific privatization is recommended and found to be in the best interest of Nova Scotians, employees will have the ability to move to the new employer with all existing rights, benefits, and entitlements. Mr. Speaker, that's signed by John Hamm. I'd like to table that.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in your final supplementary. Okay.
Oh, we wish that was true. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Premier for tabling that document. I do happen to have the same document with me, which I don't see a need to table a second time, and I see point number 5. However, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't going to do this, but I have a press release from the NSGEU dated April 5th, 2000, in which they discuss the 5 points and Premier Hamm's commitment to it. And they say in this press release, after meeting with Premier Hamm's Chief of Staff, that the best way to accomplish that is through collective bargaining, not through legislation, Mr. Speaker, which is our point over here all along. So thank you for that, and I will document and table this one to go with it. And so my question, Mr. Speaker, is this. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Clearly, we are on the wrong track because they are only listening to their union buddies when it comes to this kind of legislation, Mr. Speaker. Not business, not small business, not the major employers of the province. And so Nova Scotians will pay the price for that in the end, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier is, when will you stop listening only to these special interests and stand up for the public interest as you were elected to do?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad to hear about the former government's pro-union approach to government. Apparently, they were holding secret meetings with members of the various unions, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the member opposite is that we believe that collective bargaining, of course, and good collective bargaining regimes are good. We think that stable relations are of course very good. And I want him to know that the Premier's Economic Council, of course, is made up of some of the leading business people in this province.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because of the NDP's reckless decision to cut the subsidy to the Yarmouth Ferry, Yarmouth and the southwest Nova Scotia has suffered through economic hardship, job losses, and a massive blow to our tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, from the Department of Tourism's own figures, Yarmouth and Acadian Shores have been hit hardest by the NDP's decision. In fact, Mr. Speaker, accommodation sales in this area dropped by 11%, and that's in Yarmouth and Acadian Shores, not just Yarmouth. This number is much higher, of course, in Yarmouth and in other parts of southwest Nova. My question to the Premier is, does he still think it was a good decision for the tourism industry and for the economy of southwest Nova Scotia to cut the Yarmouth-New England ferry?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, I didn't cut the ferry. What we did is said we weren't going to continue with the subsidy. The decision to discontinue the service, of course, is the decision of the operator. I've said to the member opposite, and I've said to everyone there that we would be happy to have a sustainable ferry service between southwestern Nova Scotia and New England.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Premier and this government know that by cutting the subsidy to that ferry, they were cutting the service itself, Mr. Speaker. And that has hurt the economy. Mr. Speaker, Monday the Minister released the NDP's plan for tourism. In its own report, it says this, and I quote, Yarmouth and Acadian Shores saw a decrease of 11% in year-over-year room nights. This is related to the loss of the Cat Ferry, a significant transportation link to the province, end quote. And I will table that document right here, Mr. Speaker. And the number is obviously worse than the other parts of southwest Nova. My question to the Premier is, if your own department recognizes that the loss of the ferry has been devastating to the economy of Yarmouth and western Nova Scotia, why can't you?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to table this. This is a quote from the Leader of the Opposition back in May. It said, it's too little too late. My question to the Premier is, why have you killed the 2010 tourism season? So what will you do to help this region through tough economic times? In fact, Mr. Speaker, tourism numbers in the province were up.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this Premier continues to stand up and mislead this House. In fact, and he hasn't tabled any information to support what he's saying. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of information I want to table right now. Between January 2009 and last month, the population in southern Nova Scotia, southwest Nova Scotia, has decreased by 500%, Mr. Speaker. I'll table that. Over the past year, there were on average 330 more people looking for work. I'll table that. However, they were having to settle for part-time work, which was up 11%, Mr. Speaker. I'll table that. While full-time work was flat. I'll table that as well. Or they didn't have any work at all since unemployment was up 23% over the past year. I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate in southwestern Nova Scotia has gone up an average of 2.4%, and that's higher than last year. The Premier missed the point last week when he talked about jobs being up in southwestern Nova Scotia. The Premier only including one measure, and used one snapshot in time, and to be frank, he misinterpreted it. Culture and Recreation lost 400 workers in October. I'll table that.
Okay, your
and
question,
an average
please.
of 380
your question?
over the past year. I'll table that. Combine this with the losses in accommodations and jobs and tourism, dropped 14% over the past year. I'll table that. That's 660 jobs, Mr. Speaker. I'll table that too. Mr. Speaker, there was a combined total of 7,000 fewer room nights. I'll table that. And the occupancy rate was down 50%. I'll table that as well.
I need your question.
Visitation south to western Nova Scotia were down because of that. I'll ask my question, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's Department of Finance says that cutting the ferry has damaged southwestern Nova Scotia. His Department of Tourism says it has injured the industry. And StatsCan says it devastated the economy. Well, this Premier finally recognized in this House that cutting the Yarmouth-New England ferry the funding of the Yarmouth-New England ferry is an investment in the tourism industry and the economy of southwestern Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I tabled last week a number of statistics with respect to tourism in this province. Reality is that tourism is up, Mr. Speaker. Reality is that jobs are up in the southern region, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that more people have come into...
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Premier has the answer.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, tourism numbers in the province are up. The number of jobs associated in southern Nova Scotia is up, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, on top of all of that, the number of people coming into the employment picture, those who are now going out and looking for work, has increased because people are more hopeful.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. In response to a question earlier, the Premier indicated that passing the decision on to school boards is what he was prepared to do, yet he's giving them an impossible task, Mr. Speaker, cutting from a budget of which they control less than 15%, and they're asked to cut 22%. That's $196 million, Mr. Speaker, and a change to any of the implementation on targeted projects would have a significant impact on students in our schools. Those programs are designed, Mr. Speaker, for learning needs, to meet the learning needs of all students all across this province. So my question to the Premier is, if it's true that current school board budget reduction exercise does not require the boards to respect the funding for targeted programs, in other words, is that true? And if it's true, does that mean that this government is laying the groundwork for different boards to provide different supports for students with the same needs?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the people expect the government to go out to the school boards to tell them that we have to be able to get the books of the province back to balance and that they need to take a leadership role in doing this, Mr. Speaker. That is what we have asked them to do, Mr. Speaker. We go out, we ask the experts to make sure that we live in this province within our means and we provide the services that students need, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North and your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, the Premier may be saying that boards have been asked to do this. Boards are coming back and saying they cannot do it without cutting programs. So my question, targeted funding is geared to learning styles of our students which differ from student to student. In order to meet those needs, many different programs were put into place, and those were in consultation with parents and students and teachers, the ones most affected by that. One of those programs, Mr. Speaker, was autism and support for autism. And I had an opportunity as well last night to attend an event at the Autism Centre in Halifax. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there was not a dry eye in that room. There was not a dry eye in that room. Programs, targeted programs, which include support for autism, are on the chopping block. So my question to the Premier is this: what will happen to the equity of programming for our students if targeted funding is taken away?
Good question.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat again that we intend to keep our commitments with respect to autism funding, the ones that we made in the last election. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, over the last 10 years, 30,000 young people came out of the school system, Mr. Speaker, yet the funding for education increased by 51%.
Order, please. The Premier has the floor, and I'd ask you respect when he's up speaking, as you are when you're up speaking. Thank you. The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have asked the school boards to take on the responsibility of which is their responsibility, Mr. Speaker. Take it on and to look at how it is that we can reduce the cost to government so that we are able to ensure that the programming that students need are there, but also assists us in bringing the books of the province back to balance. Everyone, Mr. Speaker, whether they are in district health authorities, whether they're in municipalities, no matter where they are going to have to be part of the solution to the problem that was created by the former government.
The honourable member for Colchester North and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, if we weren't confused before we started, we sure are now, because these are very conflicting messages. On the one hand, the Premier is saying those are the decisions for the school board. On the other hand, he's saying, but you don't have to respect funding for autism. So my question to the Premier is this. What message do you have for the parents of autistic children when they find out that the funding for their child support is gone?
Shame on him.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's another example. It's another example of asking a question when you've already received the answer, but not having anything else to say, Mr. Speaker. The reality is, as I've said before, we make commitments with respect to autism funding. We intend to keep it.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Health was provided with the emergency room standards which were released publicly this morning. Included in the standards are required levels of emergency room training for both RNs and physicians for all emergency rooms, including community emergency departments, as well as equipment standards. While we do not dispute the necessity of these standards, many Nova Scotians would have thought that many of them would already have been in place. After all, they are emergency departments. Given that the Minister was briefed by Dr. Ross extensively yesterday, could the Minister please indicate how many of our community emergency departments are not currently meeting the training and equipment standards that were outlined by Dr. Ross?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to receive the set of standards that Dr. Ross has been working so diligently on. Mr. Speaker, this is the last piece that we required prior to releasing our response to Dr. Ross's earlier report with 26 recommendations. And as I've indicated in this House, that response will be released before the House recesses for our Christmas break, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister indicated these standards were going to make us leaders, and I hope that is the case. However, they will only make us leaders when we are certain that all the emergency room departments are able to meet the targets for treatment, necessary equipment, and training that have been established. My question to the Minister is, will her department be providing the necessary resources for community emergency departments to meet the training, the treatment, and equipment standards as presented, or will they simply no longer be allowed to function as community emergency departments?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is so negative. It's really pretty discouraging, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these standards that have been released today, Mr. Speaker, are going to raise the bar on the quality of emergency room care right across this province, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we already have a fair amount to be really pleased about here in this province. We have the EHS service in this province one of 2 accredited EHS systems in North America, Mr. Speaker, just having received their reaccreditation with a commendation, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I posed a question around the fact that our largest tertiary hospital is not meeting the CTAS Level 2 target of seeing patients within 15 minutes. In fact, as you'll remember, they're missing it by many hundreds of %. Today's CTAS Level 2 emergency room standards enshrine the same standard, or today's standards are in the same document, and they provide for a reassessment as well every 15 minutes. Well, the public is able to get information about the Capital Health District in terms of how long it takes to see a patient, and that's through their quarterly indicators that they provide. We don't have that same information for other districts. My question to the minister is, what process will she establish to ensure that all emergency departments are meeting the standards set out by Dr. Ross?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that's the point of having emergency room standards developed by Dr. Ross so that we can have some equitable measurements right across the province. We can assure our citizens that they're getting comparable care no matter where they are getting care in an emergency room, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, our plan for the implementation of these standards and for the recommendations in the Ross report will be coming before the House recesses for the Christmas period.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Education. As we approach tomorrow night's candlelight vigil to be held by staff, students and supporters of Holy Angels High School, there's little indication of what, if any, progress is being made by the department and the committee in regard to keeping this historic institution open. In Tuesday's Cape Breton Post, School Board Chair Lorne Green said, and I quote, "They're looking at possible solutions to keeping the program the way it exists now in the current building." My question to the Minister, and I will table that quote from Mr. Green. My question to the Minister, will the Minister share with the House what possible solutions her department is looking at to keep Holy Angels open in the existing facility?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the committee has been meeting, that their mandate is to develop detailed options for the board by the end of December, and I'm sure the board will be considering those shortly afterwards. I don't micromanage these committees. I've been somewhat distracted with other business of the House lately. So I have full confidence. I have full confidence in the members of the committee to do their task as assigned, and I look forward, as I'm sure the school board does, to the options that will be presented by the end of December. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the Minister is a busy person, but so is everybody else on this side of the House who looks after their constituents' business as well. Mr. Speaker, an institution with the rich history, character, pride, and Holy Angels cannot be replicated by simply packing up and moving elsewhere. This means a school as unique and significant as Holy Angels is deserving of all efforts this government can make to preserve this institution as is. There should be no stone left unturned, Mr. Speaker. This could include looking at extending the lease, furthering negotiations with the sisters for a suitable price for the building, or even a lease to purchase agreement. So, Mr. Speaker, I know those are options, but I'll present them to the Premier, and I'll ask the Premier, which of these options would you consider to save Holy Angels High School and preserve that historic institution?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you may know, there is a committee that's in place. They're looking at all the available options, and I think our point is to allow that committee to actually do its work.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the congregation of the Sisters of Notre Dame have been stewards of the quality education provided at Holy Angels for 125 years. Their contribution to the education system of Nova Scotia is worthy of great praise, as they've been tremendous partners in educating the young women of Cape Breton. So again, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Premier is what efforts are being made to talk to the sisters and once again work with them for the betterment of our education system here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, this matter is within the jurisdiction of the board to deal with. We, Mr. Speaker, have agreed to be part of the committee.
Order. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, this is a matter that's within the purview of the school board. There is a committee that's looking at the whole matter. We certainly hope that there is a resolution that will allow Holy Angels to continue to provide the quality education that they have.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the June report of the Auditor General, Chapter 3 pointed out some significant issues with how contaminated sites are handled and administered in Nova Scotia. And to quote from the Auditor General's report, Mr. Speaker, it says, quote, "The risks associated with contaminated sites in Nova Scotia are not being adequately managed to protect the public interest," unquote, and I'll table that report. The department responded by saying that there will be new tools in place to address the issue by 2010. 2010 is now winding down. In fact, the way it looks, we may be in the House until the end of 2010. Would the Minister of the Environment please tell this House what his department is doing to address the very serious issue of contaminated sites and what tools his department has implemented?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, I can tell you that we are taking this issue from the Auditor General very seriously. I can also tell you that both parties opposite had numbers of years, decades to deal with this issue. We take this issue very seriously, and we are moving forward with it. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the question was what tools are going to be put in place that the department under his leadership has committed to have in place by the end of this year. Committed to the Auditor General, I might add. Mr. Speaker, the health of Nova Scotians and the well-being of our environment may be jeopardized, and yet the department's response was, quote, "There are no unacceptable," quote, "health concerns." So, Mr. Speaker, I wonder what is unacceptable, and I will table documents about a situation his department's aware of in New Glasgow, which does involve reported health concerns. So, Mr. Speaker, from the auditor's report, we know there is no process in place for inspectors to identify, vary, or even verify the accuracy of key information reported on sites. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell this House what he is doing to make sure these weaknesses are addressed, and when will the changes come in his department to address contaminated sites?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much. Again, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, again, we point out that this issue has been addressed by the Auditor General, and we're looking into that. We're going to be moving forward. But again, I want to repeat that both parties, this issue has been ongoing for decades, and both parties had an opportunity to deal with it. I can assure you I take this job very seriously, and we'll be addressing this issue in the best interest of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister seems to be neglecting the fact that the department under his leadership, not the leadership of either of these parties, committed to fix the problem and have the tools in place by the end of 2010, and nothing has been done yet. So he has misled the Auditor General in that case, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General's report states, quote, the existence of contaminated sites which are not cleaned up may negatively impact the competitiveness of our economy, unquote. That's from the Auditor General. Mr. Speaker, I have no doubt that since this is an impediment to economic development, that the minister has made this a priority, and yet we've seen nothing. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that minister once again, when will we see the tools in place that his department promised under his ministership to the Auditor General?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to just echo that our staff, I want to have the opportunity to acknowledge all the work that they've done on this, and I can tell you that we'll be moving forward very soon, and this is something that we take very seriously. And again, I just want to reflect, each party over there had the opportunity, they missed. This government is going to do the job. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. On November 24th this year, in response to a question on midwifery, the minister indicated that there is an evaluation underway of the 3 midwifery pilot projects in the province. Of course, an evaluation is important to determine the next step, but there's a catch. This pilot project has been barely operational. Staff have been diverted in year 1 to writing procedures and setting up the program, and in every site it is offered, it falls short of the appropriate standards of care that were adopted by midwives across the country. These shortcomings clearly will cloud the results of an evaluation that we're waiting for. My question to the minister is, if you have already received this evaluation, will you table it now in the House? And if you have not, will you promise to bring it to the House as soon as you receive it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, yes, I did indicate that an evaluation is going on. I have not received the evaluation, Mr. Speaker, and until I have an opportunity to see the evaluation when it's completed, obviously I have nothing to table here in the House.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in HRM, where half of the births in the province occur, the demand for midwifery services far exceeds the supply. That means many more people are denied the service than are able to get it. We have a total of 7 practicing midwives in 3 locations in the entire province. Mr. Speaker, a midwifery practice needs more than 4 midwives in one group practice to ensure that there's a continuity of care for the families that want this service. We saw many families last year being denied a midwife because there was no backup for the few that were in the location, even here in HRM. The midwives in the springtime were busy taking allocated overtime and holidays that they couldn't carry into the new year, and people were being denied simply because their due date fell in March or at the end of the year. So this is because we do not have the minimum 4 midwives in any one location. My question to the minister is, when will she allocate the necessary resources to allow DHAs to hire a sufficient number of midwives so as to ensure sustainable community-based collaborative practices and not the current hospital-based services that we have that are inadequate?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, midwifery is a very important service for many mothers, expectant mothers, Mr. Speaker. And I've been in this House for very many years. I've seen the advocacy around midwifery and a midwifery program during a Liberal government that were reluctant to take any action whatsoever on midwifery. I saw the changes that were introduced, albeit at a snail's pace with the former government. It's only been a year and a half or so since we've seen the introduction of the pilot projects, Mr. Speaker, in the 3 DHAs, and those are now being evaluated, Mr. Speaker. As I've indicated, I have yet to see the evaluation, and I want an opportunity to review the details before we release any final report on that.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Midwifery is very important to families, as the minister knows and as she has seen over the years. What's unfortunate today is that women have less, at least in parts of the province, have less access to midwifery than they did in the past. And I'll table the Midwifery Coalition of Nova Scotia policy statement from November 2010. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, we know the benefits of midwifery. It provides more personal care. It is less intrusive and less costly. It results in healthier babies and healthier mothers. The pilot projects so far have not been set up to be community-based, and they're not adequately staffed to meet the core principles of Canadian midwifery. So we are failing midwives and women, and the evaluation that we're waiting for will be inadequate because the programs haven't been properly set up and resourced as yet anywhere in Nova Scotia. My question for the minister is, given the obvious shortcomings of the current pilot projects, will the minister commit to bringing forward a plan that not only provides access to midwifery across Nova Scotia in all DHAs, but also respects the core principles of the profession?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Midwifery Coalition, a group that I have a lot of respect for, have been involved in the development of the program in Nova Scotia, and they continue to have representation. I've met with them. My door is open always to hear from them, Mr. Speaker. The 3 pilots have all been developed in the DHAs. Are quite different from each other. They have not used the same model in every district, and this is why I think we need to look at the evaluation. And Mr. Speaker, I'm reserving my judgment on the outcomes of those pilots until I have an evaluative report. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise to my place today and address this question to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. The Minister, on Monday, the Minister released a 5-year paving plan for the province, and I would like to commend him for identifying infrastructure.
He's getting redder.
I would like to commend him for identifying infrastructure priorities and for releasing the plan to the public. This is something the public will use as a measure to which the government will be held accountable. The plan does raise some questions, however. There were no budget dollars attached to this plan. And I understand that inflation and oil costs are unpredictable, but my question to the minister is this. Why were there no estimated dollar figures attached to this plan to help taxpayers and others understand both the magnitude of the plan and the cost of implementation?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
I thank the member opposite for the question. That is one of the suggestions that I've heard from various Nova Scotians, and it is something that can be addressed the next time this not perfect plan, but first public plan for road priorities is listed. I'll take that one as a good suggestion. And it's also a further suggestion that there should be an asterisk beside every one of those plans that are co-shared between the federal government and the provincial government, and there should be another asterisk if it's appropriate, so that the municipal projects also could be noted in that way. A good piece of advice, and I thank the member for going through it. It's a piece of advice that I will certainly look upon when we publish the plan again. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did go through the plan as well, and I found Colchester County in some of those, but I also noted that those projects had already been completed. However, my question, this is a very ambitious plan, and knowing how much the plan will cost is important to members of this House and also to taxpayers. We recognize that the implementation of any plan is dependent on the dollars to support it. So my question to the, through the Speaker, to the Minister is this. As a good minister, will you assure the House that a minimum amount of capital dollars will be assigned each year for the next 5 years to support the implementation of your plan?
Question too.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you. Thank you to the member opposite. It is a good question, but I'm not going to give you much of an answer. And I know that will disappoint you because of the need for specifics, but it is one of those types of issues that it is of some real consequence, because I'm hearing from Nova Scotians lots of emails, concerns about, where is this particular road, and I want to thank the members opposite and the members of this side of the House for bringing forward their concerns. The key thing is the accountability, because I know next year at this time, basically it will be 1 year where I'll be held accountable about what was done and what wasn't done and why these particular goals were not achieved. And if they were, I will tell you, as you probably well know, I'll be patting myself on the back because the job did get done. But I thank you for your particular point of view, and I understand exactly what you're coming from. I appreciate it. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North, and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his honest comments and for his understanding that there are some flaws in the plan. So, during the press conference, the Chief Engineer reported that all major projects such as highway twinning and bridges do depend on some form of federal investment. And since the Federal Economic Action Plan is set to expire at the end of this fiscal year, and Nova Scotians are wondering about this government's ability to deliver on the plan. With the current agreement set to expire, with no new federal agreements in place, and with every department being asked to cut, the question that Nova Scotians have, and I will ask it on their behalf, what confidence can Nova Scotians have that you and your government, even with your best intentions, Mr. Minister, can actually implement the plan?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you to the member opposite. Mr. Speaker, a question that's well intended for sure. The concern, of course, comes down as we look at what the balanced budget that is part of the goal of this government and when it is going to be attained. But I can assure you opposite, and I want to assure all members of this House, that Nova Scotians are looking for hope when it comes to good roads. They've been neglected for far too long. They wanted a plan. They wanted a public plan. They want to be reassured that over the next 5 years or the next 4 years, the case will be, will that particular road get the attention that it so richly deserves? And I will assure you, and I hear the member from Argyle, of course, mentioning bridges, I will assure you that when we go over this plan, it will be a plan that will be fair to Nova Scotians, and we will do everything possible, myself as a minister, and I know the members opposite and Nova Scotians specifically. They'll make sure that their roads and their bridges are not neglected. But I thank you for the points, and they are good ones.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, on September 24th, 2 Freedom of Information requests were filed with the Department of Labour and Workforce Development. Information was requested on the Skills Development Program. Now, some information was given on one of the requests, but we have not had a formal response on either one. My question is to the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. Will the Minister please tell us the status of these Freedom of Information requests?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd be pleased to meet with the honourable member and give her an update on the status of that other request. I don't have those details personally, but I will make sure that I have the information and be pleased to pass it along to her. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on your first supplementary.
I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, but these Freedom of Information requests are more than a month overdue. I want to know, will the Minister commit to providing this information before the end of the House session?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the honourable member realizes that the FOIPOP officer for the department received that request. The process and the timeline and the amount of information are entirely up to the person in that official. And so I would hesitate to make any commitments on her behalf, because we do give the FOIPOP officers considerable independence in order to fulfill their mandates. But I can make the inquiry and check into it, but that's all that I can commit to at this time. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that these requests are supposed to be replied to within 1 month. The Department of Labour and Workforce Development does not have a great track record of responding to requests. One letter I sent dated July 30th, 2010 was not responded to until October 6th, 2010. There have been changes with the labour market agreement, and it's taken far too long for the department to account for them. Will the minister ensure that future communication will be responded to in a more timely fashion?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have any personal knowledge of the extent of requests that come into the FOIPOP officers, so I'm not sure of the workload. You know, I've offered to make inquiries, and certainly I appreciate when people apply for that information that they'd like to have the information sooner rather than later. But I will make inquiries and make sure that that information is passed along to the honourable member. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
My question is to the Acting Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture. Yesterday I brought up a subject about bringing the Boston Red Sox here to and work with the community. We're just wondering what his response to that would be today.
Order, order, order. The time for oral question period has expired. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. Earlier in question period today, in questioning to the Minister of Education and the Premier regarding the situation at Holy Angels High, it was very unclear as to where the government stands on this particular issue that's so very important to the people of my area and the people of all Cape Breton. The question, the Premier said today that it was not the responsibility of the provincial government in this matter to purchase the school. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I'll remind that it is the provincial government's responsibility to purchase capital assets in the school board, not the school boards, not the community, as is suggested in Hansard on November 9th. And in answering the question on November 9th, whether or not the Premier, the question from our leader, the opposition leader, the Premier said, the Premier was asked, will you buy the school? And the Premier said, well, the answer to that is no. And then he goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, that we might want to see it purchased through the community group. You know, and we made reference to that at the time. I would ask that the Premier either tell this House whether or not this government is going to buy this school, or stop misleading the Minister of Education, who was also misleading this side of the House, as to keeping that option open.
I thank you, the honourable member, for the information, but I don't believe that is a point of order. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make an introduction.
Certainly.
I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery, where today we have the Warden of Kings County, the newly minted first female Warden of Kings County, Diana Brothers, and her husband, Jim, here to take in some of the proceedings of the House. Historic, of course, election in Kings County, and so I'd like for the House to give her a warm welcome and her husband.
I'll recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into Committee of the Whole House on bills.
Carried.
Order, please. Call the committee to order. The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you please call Bill number 103, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Bill 103, the Motor Vehicle Act. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
It is my pleasure just to clarify some of the points made earlier, and I think there might be some misunderstanding about what this particular amendment is. We're repealing something because it's redundant, and I think Nova Scotians deserve just to have that taken out because—
Order, please. The chatter is pretty high, and the Minister is trying to get a point across, so if we could give her the courtesy of listening to her, that would be appreciated. The Honourable Minister of Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say to the House that when 6 or more points are added to your record, then the registrar will call that person in for an interview because the person obviously needs some support with their driving, and so they'll be called in when you have 6 points or more. As soon as you get to 10, you know what happens. So the number 4 is a bit redundant because you were it was just 2 before that. And also the question with the member opposite was, it refers only to fully licensed drivers. That means all other drivers, our new drivers, will get their notices when they reach 4. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton North.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just continuing on discussion, I appreciate the Minister's clarifications. However, there's a couple of points I think that are bear and a note comment on with Committee of the Whole House. And as we all know, the Motor Vehicle Act is a complicated one in which Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has a role, one in which Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal has a role, one in which the Department of Justice all play a role, and I think all of them, in my knowledge, have brought forward amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act that have been deemed appropriate and matters that have come before this House, some that have had vigorous debate, others that have had consensus and have moved very quickly because they were common sense initiatives. And as we all know, the challenges facing the motoring public, interacting with pedestrians in an ever-changing world requires that an act such as the Motor Vehicle Act is going to, on an ongoing basis, require that it be changed and updated and be relevant to the current age that we're in. We also know, Mr. Chair, as it relates to initiatives that this House has supported where we deal with the impacts, negative impacts, as we go into a season where Operation Red Nose is now being organized by volunteer groups with the Insurance Bureau of Canada and the Minister having a role in playing with that and supporting it. I know I was down at Cape Breton University for the launch of the event there with the university, the Students' Union, who are the host in Cape Breton in the Sydney area for Operation Red Nose. Rudy the Red Nose was there in terms of the mascot, but the policing community, everybody recognizes that things definitely need to change and laws would change. And the Motor Vehicle Act itself, Mr. Speaker, has changed to deal with public's outrage and disgust with regards to irresponsible driving, especially under the influence, a matter that comes forward and something that impacts with offences that continue to go up. We've seen the recent changes with blood alcohol levels, which some cases people think, is that too much? But then again, every life is important, and to mitigate that, those negative outcomes, we have to look at what is the best practices. And I believe that Nova Scotia has had a very good record, and I know Mothers Against Drunk Driving, having just recently the national president here from the HRM, but a Nova Scotian, has been a positive impact. And I would like to say that those are the things that we have to deal with this House that I know all members take seriously. But I would say, with regards to the bill before the House that we're talking about, it does fall in that sort of nebulous land of relevance when there's so many important topics we're dealing with. We're now dealing with a piece of legislation that deals with notification around 4 points. And while I do appreciate the Minister's comments, I do know, and probably from personal experience, regrettably, about when we were pulled over for a potential infraction. And we do know that oftentimes officers, aside from what equipment tells them, they have to use their own personal judgment, and they have to try to assess every situation and take it into account. But one of the things we do know is that when the officers go and they call in to the centre, they also nowadays get the abstract. They can actually see, Mr. Chair, what your driving record looks like, good, bad, or indifferent, and that may deal with some discretion as to if it's an ongoing concern. They would know that, and they will deal with it more harshly than someone who inadvertently has made a mistake. But one of the things they don't do is discuss your abstract with you. They just merely have the information and they make whatever calls, but you're never informed at that point in time if you have had any demerits with regards to your driving record. But the fact of the matter is they have that information, and I think one of the things that the minister and her officials, and one of the things to look at is the fact that police officers at the point of contact on the side of a road also have an opportunity with public education of explaining any changes and giving warnings, and they do give warnings, and people try to heed those warnings, and those of us, aside from potential infractions, have had infractions, and you have to pay the price for that. And the price is not just monetary, it also can be your driving record. And your driving record, of course, can impact your insurance costs in terms of potential risk, and your insurance company will let you know if they're not happy with your abstract either. But Mr. Chair, one of the things that the minister has not brought forward in a modern context, especially within Service Nova Scotia, is why when we're registering now, we cannot have our email information held with Service Nova Scotia through the Register of Motor Vehicles. Why that if they need to communicate with you on any matter, if you can make the choice, as I do, you know, with your banking information now, you can say, I want to choose electronic contact to eliminate the need for mail, to reduce the costs, reduce outcomes, and you get the notification. And so one of the things that I would hope the department would look at is why can't consumers who are going in and paying for these fees not have access and the choice on any matters to pick electronic correspondence that can be sent to their attention, and not just for a point infraction where you may have a future negative reaction from our good law enforcement officials and the department, but why can't you get that notification? Maybe it's your renewal for your license. Maybe it's your actual physical license. Maybe it's your license plate renewal, the stickers that go on them. All of those things I'm hoping the minister will take a look at, because it is a way when the government's talking about their need to get back to balance after, you know, a very ruckus year of over-the-top spending that was needless in a recession. So if the government and the Minister of Finance are looking for ways to reduce expenses, I believe the minister has at her disposal, because they're running computers in every access Nova Scotia. We know that the Auditor General's talked recently about some of the concerns with regards to, I say, with firewalls or the ability for people to possibly hack into to the computer systems, or the fact that employees that are no longer employees still have access codes and passwords to the systems that could gain information. But I know when the minister is responding to those things in the Auditor General's report, because I know the minister and I know she'll take those findings of the Auditor General seriously, and she will act to deal with them. I do know that. But I would say to the minister, rather than this piece of legislation, how are we using technology that the taxpayers are currently paying for and will pay for to better communicate to the citizens, and to eliminate the need for paper, to eliminate costs that are unnecessary, to stop the paper flow that's not required, and somehow find a way that, for instance, if you hit the 4-point notice or mark, regardless, that you get an email that tells you this is now 4 points and tells you what the future consequences are. That actually falls in the category of free once you set it up, because the system can automatically provide that notification. And as you say, when you get to 6 or more, it should be giving you the red flag that you're really treading on thin ice, and you should be responding in a more prudent manner. And as we all know, you can get other driving training experiences. You can go back. You can work with the driving trainers or the officials within the department. And for those that have totally crossed the line, they have to go back and start all over as though they're a beginner. and deal with that whole education, do the road tests, all those things over again. And if you've broken and crossed that line, fair enough. But the minister at her disposal has a means to allow and to educate and update Nova Scotians rather than this piece of legislation at a time when there's many weighty issues for us to deal with that, again, could be dealt with through regulation, could be dealt with in a manner that public education, and could be dealt with to efficiently streamline. And if the minister were coming in with a piece of legislation that was to bring to us suggestions about how we improve the system, merely that it's not necessary, really it's not until you're after 6. Well, Mr. Speaker, or Chair, I should say, what happens is oftentimes, because we're busy and you move on, you sometimes need those reminders, and that's why the reason was for the letters in the first place. But again, the minister does have the ability and I think the capacity, and I do believe the leadership know how to go in there and say, how do we make technology that taxpayers are already funding work better, and use it not only as a notification and for administrative processes around the Motor Vehicle Act, but as an education, an advisory, and a warning process. If we, as those that hold licenses, register, and can provide our email address, choose to opt out of mail and receive electronic copy instead, I would think that that's the type of stuff I would hope would have come forward for discussion that would improve outcomes, and again, it actually be part of reducing costs. As the Minister of Finance always says, and he gets up and he says, well, what would you cut? Well, you can cut useless red tape, and I don't disagree. The Minister's trying to talk about that, but you could improve while cutting and saving taxpayers' dollars at a time to make up for some of the spending habits of the Minister of Finance that have been out of control, and we want to help him get back to balance, because he needs to get his head back on his shoulders about what he created and now he owns. And it's not about blaming, because I know that when we deal with Motor Vehicle Act, there are budget pressures that come forward, and we know that the Auditor General has passed his judgment, that their own auditors through Deloitte, an international firm, has passed their judgment, and we know that the most recent report of the Auditor General has indicated yet again that it is the Minister of Finance and the government he's part of that in a decade has created the first deficit, and that was not on the backs of the previous government, because the previous government had a balanced budget, and the government's own auditors, Mr. Speaker, had indicated clearly through the public accounts process that the budget was balanced and would have been in balance, but it was the choices that the minister and cabinet had made to drive through this House and reckless spending, rather than maybe more practical things that could have been done with regards to the Motor Vehicle Act that actually would help Nova Scotians, assist Nova Scotians in dealing with their responsibilities and duties if they're given the privilege. And we all know, Mr. Chair, that driving is a privilege. It's not a right, it is a privilege. And part of what we get into society these days is everyone assuming everything is a right when we have a right to vote, and from that come many privileges. And sometimes that's lost, and sometimes we're frustrated. But rules are put in place for a reason. And I know, Mr. Chair, that the minister, in wanting to make changes, and will hopefully go beyond what was a need for a piece of legislation that staff were put to the exercise, and people said, what can we find? Go scrape up any ideas whatsoever that can form the basis of a bill. And here we are, Mr. Chair, and we are at a point where I believe that this gives us the chance, by virtue of our ability to speak to this today, to emphasize to the minister and to share with all Nova Scotians that I do believe we can make real improvements, and we can indeed build on what has basically been a light bill, which is again something that will be counted as part of numbers as opposed to substance from this session. But there are matters of substance that can result, and I think that's the reason why we have the debate. I know the Minister of Finance has been asking for ideas and chastising everyone if he feels that we haven't had them, and that the Minister of Finance will, at some point, so far any ideas about cutting or savings he's dismissed, because he really only uses the what would you cut as his exercise to buy some time and to hopefully distract from the fact that he has been a reckless spender and has not managed the resources of Nova Scotians the way they said they would, but then again, saying one thing and doing another is a common trend and pattern that we've witnessed in the last 18 months. The type of thing where you'd say, you know, I suppose, Mr. Chair, the government in Southwest Nova probably has to have less law enforcement on the highways because there's less traffic because they cut the ferry service. So maybe that was part of his way of finding efficiencies, because if you cut off a link, and in terms of balancing a budget, which they didn't balance and can't balance because they won't, but the fact of the matter is maybe that's a reduction measure so that people will have less points to be demerited because there's no one traveling on the highways because we've cut off a vital link. If that is good stewardship of the Motor Vehicle Act and the like by the government, in a way, I guess, in some ways, maybe it's because the Minister of Justice knew he was going to cut policing officers and take boots off the streets, so there's less officers on the highways and less traffic. I guess that's their idea of savings, but it's a rather bizarre one, to say the least, if that's how the thinking goes in the cabinet room these days, because that's the only way you can sort of, you know, bring this to a rather ridiculous level, but that's where we find ourselves because that's where the government has chosen to go, Mr. Chair. And as a result of that, we have the bill that's currently before the House at this time, and we have a bill that doesn't deal with modernizing and talking about drivers in a modern context in terms of what's before us. Because, Mr. Chair, as we all know, most vehicles now literally have the equivalent of a full operating computer in the vehicle. Most cars are getting very, very sophisticated, and even lower cost vehicles have a lot of sophisticated systems in them now. They're all computer driven. Those are things that one would think, you know, where are partnerships? Can you sign up? Can you use, if you're a user of OnStar, a way of using that communication to advise you and to alert you of any information that you choose and sign up to do, because you can sign up, as we do, as members of the legislature, to get updates from the legislative library. Easy enough. They put it in. We give them our account. They don't send us paper. They send us a link. We get that information. It's done every day with regards to press reporting and communications. So why couldn't the Registry of Motor Vehicles itself use that same type of very simple, very cost-effective, sort of wasteful processes to help inform and educate Nova Scotians? I would hope, Mr. Chair, that those are some of the things that the minister and her officials, and hopefully the government, will take some serious look at in terms of where we're at, because we know there are issues with us, and one of the #1 concerns, as we've seen in recent studies, is about driver distraction, and instances of driver distraction accelerating. While we have put in place the no talking on cell phones, or at least holding that device in your vehicle, every one of us in this chamber, and I know every citizen that I'm aware of, can see a car going by with someone who's being irresponsible. But it's not about, is it an inconvenience, because we know the statistics, Mr. Chair, the statistics of driver distraction, especially with handheld devices. First it was cell phones, now it is texting. And you know, the device is either ringing or buzzing, and people feel the need to find out what's that information, because everything is instantaneous now. And while some people have very sophisticated text-to-talk or talk-to-text formats, most people are sitting there with their devices, and we can see them in their car all the time. I, too, have been guilty of that, as have many other people. But I do take as well that it is a serious matter. I do understand. I always have my headset in my car if I'm going to make a call. And people say to me, it's inconvenient. Well, Mr. Chair, we all know that you can go to a Dollarama and buy a headset for your car for $1 or $2 to provide you with a safer way to drive. So it's no excuse for someone to say it's inconvenient when, in fact, Mr. Chair, it is very convenient, it's very cost-effective for drivers to drive more responsibly and safer, so that if their hands are not on their phones or looking at screens, they're on the wheel, driving their car is what they're supposed to do in the first place. But again, we've dealt with legislation, Mr. Chair, that's affected everything from you know, people using their cars because they live in them, they commute in them, they eat in them. There are now offices in them. They have the jacks now for their computers to be charged up, their devices to go. There's DVDs, there's CDs, there's everything possible that you can think of is now accommodated in a vehicle. And as a result of that, it puts pressure on people to stay within where the motor vehicle started with basic rules of the road. And now it is a very complex set. And as I stated when I started to speak, the minister is always going to be, whether that is Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, or Justice primarily, are going to be constantly coming to this legislature with amendments to legislation because things will change. So we do not know in 5 or 10 years what the latest technology is going to provide for operating vehicles. I would think, Mr. Chair, like the minister who could be astute, that the actual car manufacturers now are going to be producing vehicles with onboard capacity to reduce driver distraction and driver error and provide for a lot more of ability for people to be driving more responsibly. And I think those are things that we will see from industry responding because so many provinces and states now are bringing in legislation. And at the same time, we know that even in the HRM, I know in the CBRM, that the police are trying, and they do targeted efforts to deal with distracted drivers. And of course, there's infractions for that. And maybe we need to up the penalties because it seems that people are not, Mr. Chair, taking seriously driver distraction with regards to their BlackBerries and cell phones in their vehicle. And until industry and trends come to the point it's cost effective, as I said earlier, vehicles today, even modestly priced vehicles, have all what we call the whistles and bells, automatic door locks, power windows, everything that's in there, the system, stereo systems, because the cost of production has brought the cost of introducing it even to a modest economy car, is enabling them to provide all those features because it has become the economy of scale that produces that. And now we know with technology, with our BlackBerries, iPhones, iPads, whatever people are utilizing, and cell phone technology and integrated technology, that the system in a new car today can accommodate those devices. So the next step is, are the vehicles themselves going to contain those devices that will make it more safer and reduce driver distraction and improve road safety? So those are some things that the minister, in looking at when they meet on a pan-Canadian basis through the various departments to say, are there national standards that can be applied universally? Are there ways that the provinces and territories can have, which we do, we do it on trade, we've done it on a number of initiatives, to have a standard that is pan-Canadian and one that updates it so that you're not questioning when you leave one province and traveling to another what the rules of the road are, because right now it's a hodgepodge of legislation and regulations. And we do know that sometimes you see the signs that say things are prohibited or not. Well, the minister in this modern context, rather than just a piece of legislation that merely talks about 4 points or higher, no longer sending it to you, I would have hoped could have said, here are the things we're going to do to interact better with those that hold a license, that the motoring public. Here are ways where you can use existing technology that will better inform you and keep you informed and advise you and warn you. So if you do have an offense, there's no playing dumb about it. You know, because you've been receiving that information, what your obligations and duties and responsibilities are to have the privilege of being a driver. And that, Mr. Chair, is to me responsible, just as it was responsible for us previously to eliminate the ability for adults to be smoking in a car with minors. Just as much as we over the time have changed requirements for child seat safety, with any number of other things that with a vehicle and its safety, we have a bill that we're talking about, again, that is more about counting numbers than it is about improving outcomes. And so the minister said it's redundant because, but it's not. It would be more helpful if the minister would use the technology at her disposal, Because the Auditor General has talked about computer systems being antiquated within the department and motor vehicles, because the firewalls have not been there with the minister, and I do believe, as I've said before, the minister will take action and make improvements, and I do believe the government will do the right thing there, but will they do smart things and not just bringing a new computer? Will they be smart enough to take the advice of this House? Because they came to it with a bill, so they're going to get some advice. Now, so far they haven't acted on practical or reasonable things that have come forward from the opposition, but they may find themselves at some point in need of trying to collaborate and hopefully maybe more willing to discuss these matters here in the chamber because, Mr. Chair, they have those tools at their disposal. If the systems are antiquated, they're bringing new ones in. The Registry of Motor Vehicles can be much more user-friendly, allow people to avoid long queues in access centres, and get the basic information they need and go in and have a streamlined process that helps everyone reduce costs. You know, if we use the technology, then frontline employees could be doing more public serving use than just dealing with administrative lineups and paper processes, when we could eliminate that to a much greater degree, Mr. Chair. But those are things we don't see, and those are things that have not been referenced with the introduction of this bill. Those are things that have not come forward in the House. We continue to try and offer up practical, pragmatic ways where the Minister of Finance can work with his colleagues to try and reduce his reckless spending ways and get him off the deficit roller coaster he seems to put Nova Scotians on, and it's not a ride that's any fun, let me tell you. But and that's something maybe the minister could, Service Nova Scotia, could bring something to keep the driving rules of the government to be a little bit to stay. I was going to say, my honourable colleague from Dartmouth East says the Dexter bus. Yes, maybe the Motor Vehicle Act could be adjusted to try and deal with the Dexter bus and get them to stay between the lines and indeed, Mr. Chair, make improvements that will benefit Nova Scotians more than necessarily this bill will do. So, and I'd like to know, and I forget in her comments, but if the minister indicated what the expense of the prior notification was. I'm sure she's done that, because I'm sure the Minister of Finance would have expected and extracted what those exact numbers were, rather than just say we need a bill for the House, we need something that will tie up some time. So therefore, this is really costing us a lot. We're going to make some savings, but we know that's not the case, unfortunately, Mr. Chair. And and I'm sure people such as the Deputy House Leader has provided some very practical, pragmatic, in his own way. Being an individual, Mr. Chair, who has served as a paramedic and been on the roadways and probably seen probably more often the worst of driving rather than commenting on the best of driving skills. And I know that the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader probably has never had to worry about his abstract or any points or demerits, and so maybe he's not as worried about what this bill is about and hasn't had the need to get that paperwork in the mail that the government is spending taxpayers' dollars on as a reminder. I can tell, Mr. Chair, by his reaction that that is the case, and know that he would be a good steward of the Motor Vehicle Act while on the roadways of Nova Scotia or elsewhere for that matter. However...
Order, please. Order. The chatter's getting a little loud. The Minister of Finance is having a hard time hearing. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can speak up for the Honourable Minister if he'd like, but I didn't really notice the noise. I felt it was people clamoring to agree that the government wasn't doing enough with its legislation. I thought they were all talking about, yes, we should have been doing more. Why the heck were we bringing these things in? Why a caucus didn't we think of something more smart and astute to do? That's the chatter I'm hearing, Mr. Chair, from across the way. I hear members talking now, vigorously about what do we do to get to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and get to the Minister of Finance so they can be more astute in bringing forward changes to the Motor Vehicle Act that actually will matter. And in fact, changes, Mr. Chair, that through regulation, and that's funny because we have debate here, even a question period, about what it should be regulation versus legislation. But again, Mr. Chair, this is a matter where the minister does have a good opportunity at her disposal. She has the ability to, I think, embrace the Nova Scotian drivers by saying we will give you access to more technology-friendly ways to interact and to be aware of what's on your abstract, to be advised of that. Again, free of charge, doesn't require a stamp, doesn't require envelopes, paper. It can all be electronically driven, just no different than your bank does, no different than your insurance company can do, and reduce and mitigate those costs versus a bill that has come in for the sole purposes of just saying we no longer want to put notices in the mail over 4 demerit points because really it's not until there's 6 or more that you're called to task. Well, again, the government can take this as an opportunity rather than just being dismissed for what at face value it is, and that is a need to count bills. And we were scouring all of the cabinets, I'm sure, of the departments to say what's out there and what ideas are there, just so there could be a bill count for this session. And unfortunately, as been indicated, matters that could have been brought in, such as this, and improved upon, would have been much more welcome, would have been lauded, and probably would have gone through this House in a much quicker fashion than it has, because we in the opposition see it for what it is, and that is just a need to count bills rather than improve outcomes. And somehow, with the Motor Vehicle Act, if all of the government's senior personnel and all of the capacity within the Departments of Service Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, and Justice could come up with was this measure with regards to an amendment to the Act, then, Mr. Chair, this is something that's a sad day for the government, because I would think that there's many more pressing matters where the Motor Vehicle Act should be amended for, as been discussed. Other ways where, if it's technology and other aspects of delivery from the Registry of Motor Vehicles, that the minister, we'd be happy to say, you know, is there regulation making authority in areas where there is common agreement that those things should be updated, rather than coming back here to the House of Assembly. We now find ourselves in Committee of the Whole House on bills, speaking to the title of it, and at the same time saying at $20,000+ a day to be here, aside, that's just to operate the House, let alone what Nova Scotians are paying for salaries and the expense accounts and the like of the government as they go about continuing to rack up the bills and keep them coming. People wonder, Mr. Chair, why is it so much money is being spent so needlessly? And it's just it's part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern, Mr. Chair, and you know that is disturbing at the minimum. And you know, the Minister of Natural Resources said to me that that's what he learned from us guys. Well, I only know, Mr. Speaker, because I came in the House the same time now as a member for Halifax Fairview, who serves as the Minister of Finance. And during that time, I remember being in this House when balanced budgets were coming, historic. First time in over 40 years. And at the time, it's funny how some people would vote for something and then vote against another day and then forget. Amnesia has come over the current government ranks quite quickly after June of 2009. But there is an institutional memory that remembers, because within Hansard and within our libraries are contained the information of all of the votes and all of the debates that were previously there. And what I do know about my time on the government side and the Motor Vehicle Act, I don't recall when we brought a bill forward that was to amend it over how many points you would no longer get a notice in the mail for. That I do know. And that is something the current government did not learn from the last government. In my time, Mr. Chair, from a majority government to 2 minority governments, at the time, a lot of things would have been discussed, and they were, and a lot of compromises, House leaders, and they talk about legislation, and you deal with matters. And quite frankly, while other people were fixated on calling how many days and hours we put in here in the legislature, the reality is they count days and weeks rather than hours and outcomes. And I do think if we were truly interested, it really should be, if there's less legislation, if we met for a shorter period of time, but we actually had a better quality of debate and better outcomes, then that's what we should be defending and that's what we should be educating. But we seem to want to count time and days in a House. Now, I know in places like New Brunswick and other chambers that meet for long periods of time would maybe sit 2 hours a day versus sitting for anywhere from 4, 6, 8+ hours, depending, as we know. 24. Lived through that. Won't forget that one in a long time. But the reality is, those are realities that we've experienced here that are different. But, so what we're found to do is at over $20,000 a day, in not to mention the cost of all of our being here, the staff being here, departmental people, on citizens coming, going to law amendments for measures that we see might have been, if there was consultation, an ability to mitigate. But instead, what we are is with a bill that, Mr. Chair, is to no longer give you a notice in the mail after 4 demerit points, rather than a bill that says we're going to improve driver information, driver services, and we are going to improve accountability and responsibility through the means at our disposal without having to rack up, you know, millions and millions and millions more, as the Minister of Finance likes to do, rather than, you know, look at improvements and savings and efficiencies. And that's unfortunate, but we are where we are. And the government has seen fit to try and have a mishmash of legislation to confuse Nova Scotians, because by some, as I say, Mr. Chair, some bills by title, how can you argue with them? Or the overarching principle, how can you be against it? And yet there's no weight. There may be a sentence. In some cases, maybe there's 2, but very light. But for the average person, the public, they see bills such as the one before this committee, Mr. Chair, that, again, just adds a number, talks about a government outcome and improvement, but it really isn't. And it's regrettable, but it is the reality of where we find ourselves. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I know that my colleagues who are talking want to get back to making sure that there can be some more amendment, more capacity to get by frivolous matters and getting to more functional and prudent things that we could be doing that deal with the fiscal balance and getting back to balance in debate, not just the finances, but it'd be nice to get back to a balance of informed debate rather than the bill we have before us. And of course, for the minister, we'll see it forward, but I would hope again that she will take the opportunity before her to get beyond the political exercise of a government that was desperate to have bills before the House and look at where it can be one of leadership for the department. Because I can tell you, I know, Mr. Chair, and I know and I believe this, the minister is a minister and a person of substance who has ability well beyond what this bill represents. I do understand it's about politics because it isn't about the person, because the person I know would do much more than just what could be seen as a housekeeping bill. And I know the minister, if given the opportunity, and I know the minister probably I know the minister seeks advice, looks to take it, and I know that hopefully we'll be able to get beyond this bill and look to future improvements to the Motor Vehicle Act, that some of them which I've discussed, that maybe we can have that informed debate and maybe we can build some consensus, and just maybe we could come to this chamber another day, hopefully in the spring session, and hopefully be able to agree upon some changes on legislation that all 3 parties of the House have talked about, have talked about them in advance, that literally, as we say, they've been socialized. Because another matter that with this bill and others, and I think, I don't know what it is for those members that may be new, but to say you were invited to a bill briefing and say that's your consultation is not the case. To be called in to a department to meet with the minister or senior officials to explain what the proposed legislative changes would be, to seek some input on what that would be. Those things used to be offered up. I would hope that the minister and all ministers would start getting back to voluntarily suggesting and and inviting people so that there is more informed debate. Because I know in my portfolios previously an effort was always made and extended to invite in your critics, to talk about the areas. You could highlight where you're going. And I'll tell you the reason why, Mr. Chair, because if your critics come in, if they understand what you're trying to do, then hopefully when you have debate, it can be informed debate. And the minister then, when giving you that opportunity, can hold you to task because you were given that opportunity in if you're going to be critical, to say you had an opportunity, you could have been constructive, you could have talked to us, you could have made recommendations, we could have looked at amendments if they're necessary, and we don't see that. And that has been very disturbing as part of many other things that have affected this legislature that I believe has brought us back rather than forward as a democracy. And being the oldest in the country, one that we heralded, is to me, Mr. Chair, a real setback. But I believe that this piece of legislation, as other ones we will speak to, and in some ways, matters of substance which we understand will go through. Other matters like this, as you can see, is consuming time because Nova Scotians need to know what it is their legislature is doing and what it is the government is bringing forward and why it is that we find ourselves trying to say to this government who asks and states that they want feedback but refuse it, dismiss it, and won't allow it, will not embrace any dialogue. So I'm hoping, Mr. Chair, that somehow, someday, and it's going to be here, it doesn't have to be somewhere, here at this legislature, that we will find an ability and a capacity to say there are some things that can cross over the political lines. Why, Mr. Chair, something as innocuous as this could not have been shared and talked about in advance, I don't know. I can tell you, Mr. Chair, that I've in my responsibilities, and I know the minister, who's also the Minister of Immigration, when I called him in my critic role and asked for a briefing, the minister and her deputy were kind enough to allow that briefing to go. And I went up and I received the briefing because I had a genuine interest. And I know the minister's working on a strategy, and it's incumbent upon me to look at that strategy. If there's ideas or changes or critique, that she receive it before it's on the floor of this House. That way we really do have informed debate. I do know that I asked the Minister of Justice if I could have a briefing from the department, and that was refused. So there's the change just in there. And I do know in my energy critic role, I did ask the minister, and the minister did agree, and he actually said he wants to be in the briefing. But I also know there were other pressing matters, such as Lower Churchill. But the point is, the willingness was there, and there's never been an issue brought up by me against the minister because I know the door was open. But that goes to show you the inconsistency when we talk about legislation about that. Now, under Service Nova Scotia, for something innocuous, which should have been small, could have been improved if it was discussed front end. We could have maybe had some positive changes where we come in here and rather than to be sarcastic and look it down as just another bill counting exercise, and actually at the front end made a bill that all three parties could agree on and support the minister and actually give kudos where they're deserved. Because I also know the minister, in her other role in terms of emergency management organization, in the recent catastrophe of weather in Southwest Nova, has done an outstanding job, and we've lauded her, and Meat Cove as well, and have lauded her and her officials and their teams for responding. And it's only proper and appropriate that we do that recognition. And that's why I know, and I truly believe, I can only believe, I believe, therefore I take it as no, that a bill like this really was just more of a catch paper and have some busy work so we can count bills rather than something of substance, because the minister has dealt with issues of substance very outstandingly and has given full marks for doing that. And that's why, you know, Mr. Chair, when we move to next steps, because yesterday I sent a note because I know the Minister of Health was on CTV Newsnet and I caught the interview that she had on the National Newsnet about the organ donation. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why I lauded the minister, because I know with the Premier and the member for Richmond previously, when we were in a different situation and traveled to Miami to
to look at forensic issues and pathology when we needed a new morgue here, and dealing with the policing and investigation. One of the things we were part of was the organ donation, understanding it, and when it came back here, and people said, well, you're in Miami. Well, I now know the now Premier went there and had a hard time because he was not feeling well at the time, but he went and he did a great effort to get through that. Point being is we came back, Mr. Chair, and we could agree across party lines that we had to do the right thing for a new forensic facility here, or morgue for lack of the simplistic word. But we were able to be here, and the critic for the Liberals and the now Premier, in terms of leader, we were able to agree that these things were necessary because we saw it firsthand, and we saw the true reality of organ donating because we were in the OR lab from the observatory side and saw it and understood it. And as much as your site takes one thing, what you saw was the professionalism, the dignity, and the understanding from those professionals about what they were doing meant saving lives because someone's life was lost. And what it spoke to, Mr. Chair, at a very serious matter, across political lines, we were able to go do that. Some people question, were you just down there in the sunny climes? And we came back and we had consensus. We had consensus, and we were able, Mr. Chair, to agree not to politicize that matter. And I'm very glad that the Minister of Health is taking good measures, because I too have signed, as she indicated yesterday in the interview, she signed her card. A lot of people don't understand and don't know. But it speaks, Mr. Chair, to when parties and a government can do things right if they have the desire to work collectively and collaboratively to do that. Now, we may not always agree on the mechanics, but the point is, that's an example where the Minister on the Motor Vehicle Act, on a very simple measure, could have done the same thing and didn't require traveling anywhere, and nothing is near as serious in one matter or as important as those other matters. But I know in my time on a government and opposition side where things are out of sync. And one has to ask, why is it that there can't be more consistency and continuity with our ability to work together as legislators for the common good of the people, for the public good, as is down on the walls inscribed here in this House. And so the Minister, I would hope, is going to take from these points, and I believe she will, saying, how do we make this system work better? Because she has new tools at her discretion that weren't there before. She will be updating, as I say, through Deloitte, her systems. And as a result of that, any tangible capital assets, I'm sure that the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal on the infrastructure and procurement side would work with them to make sure we can have more consumer-friendly, user-friendly systems that actually will take what we have as a bill today before this House and actually have practical, usable, informative, and advisory and warning systems built in. And that's something, Mr. Chair, that we could all benefit from. So even if this was a bill to count numbers in the House, I don't think all has to be lost, because I do believe what can be found is some good ideas that we can share and build on. So, Mr. Chair, I should say, with that and the Committee of the Whole House, I'm hoping that some next steps, and I do hope the Minister will take the comments for what they are, putting aside the politics of the fact that this is a political exercise, but there are some practical and prudent things that could be achieved. And Mr. Chair, I look forward to the Minister's continued leadership on more substantive level, as we know she's done, and I know she can, and I hope will do. And with that, we will be happy to support her in those efforts. And I appreciate this opportunity. I know with the other department she's working with, hopefully we'll have other matters affecting the Motor Vehicle Act that will be seen by Nova Scotians with less of a skeptical eye than a bill for counting purposes. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise on Bill number 103 in Committee of the Whole House and to discuss the clause and also, of course, the title. And interestingly, as I was just going through some of the bills of this session, it was interesting to note that the title of this act, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, is exactly the same as the title of Bill number 97, which is also titled an act to amend Chapter 293, the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, which just goes to prove my honourable colleague from Cape Breton North's position, which was that there are some that obviously have come forward in this session which, well, not taking away their merit or their value, could obviously have been combined. In this case, we're actually amending the exact same act. Very similar effect, actually, of the two acts, which is very interesting, Mr. Speaker. I can remember not that long ago taking my driver's test. Well, I guess it was a long time ago now, 20 years ago, or yeah, 20 years ago. And I remember studying. I remember studying the driver's handbook at the time on the plane coming back to visit my family in the UK. And one of the things that you always paid a lot of attention to was what were the things that were going to cause you to lose your license, or what were the things that were going to cause you not to get a license in the first place. And that, of course, is what this bill deals with in amending Section 282 in particular, actually, is the section it issues. And I was taking a look earlier today at the current driver's handbook, and of course, Section 1 of that book, page 28, the first thing it does is talk about the demerit points in the section of the Motor Vehicle Act in which it determines. So I thought I might take some time and go through what some of those points are, and so that we know where you might get the points taken off and where you might not. There might be some things that people could learn here while we're here. So, Mr. Speaker, of course, many of there appear to be basically three different ways you can get demerit points off in 2 points, 4 points, or 6 points. Obviously, somebody liked even numbers when they wrote the act. The fact is that you will not, I'll focus on the ones that are 4 or 2 for the moment, because that's really where this is important. According to the explanatory note in this bill, the registrar will not issue a warning notice when 4 or more points are issued on the driver's abstract. So, of course, you would get 4. You would see 4 points for improper passing, for example, which is Section 114 and 115 of the Motor Vehicle Act, speeding in excess of the speed limit, which is Section 102 of the Motor Vehicle Act, speeding in excess of the posted limit in a school area, which, interestingly enough, is a much higher fine, which is Section 103. Speeding in excess of the posted limit by 31 kilometers an hour or more. And I think we all read in the news the other day, I believe it was up near Wentworth, somebody was stopped for going at 182 kilometers an hour, I believe was the speed. And that also has 4 points. Mr. Speaker, failing to yield to a pedestrian is 4 points, and I might take a moment just to discuss that. That, of course, deals with crosswalks, and I think we'll all remember the bill that I have before the House dealing with crosswalk flags. And let me digress for a moment and just talk about that issue, which you could actually get 4 points on your license for failing to do. It's interesting to note that in the past month, 6 additional U.S. jurisdictions have now implemented crosswalk flags as part of their statewide program for crosswalk safety. I find that interesting. I know the minister was very supportive of crosswalk flags, and I appreciate that. The Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, not so supportive of the bill, but I think it was because he didn't feel that the bill was necessary to have those go into place. And I know his the deputy minister of that department has indicated in a letter just this week, in fact, that they would be pleased to see them on provincial roads, and I know that there's now an effort. In fact, in Port Williams, there's going to be a meeting on crosswalk flags in the next couple of weeks, where Port Williams may be implementing crosswalk flags. I'm not exactly sure which riding Port Williams is in off the top of my head, but sometimes not quite sure where the line is on some of those boundaries. Mr. Speaker, it goes on to number 4, which is failing to, or another 4.1 is failing to obey a traffic control person. And of course, we know how serious that can be. That not only applies to police officers, but of course at construction sites and so forth. And we know that there are men and women who, you know, and not to speak too lightly of it, they do put their lives on the line in some cases in a very dangerous situation, often on very high-speed roads. And I commend this and previous governments for actually changing the rules and strengthening them around passing both construction sites and so forth. Mr. Speaker, when I actually, in fact, misled the House when I said there was only even-numbered ones. There is actually one that is 3 points, which is speeding in excess of the posted limit between 16 and 30 kilometers an hour inclusive. You know, Mr. Speaker, speeding is, of course, very important, and I know that the government has been lobbied by the municipalities to consider allowing a lower speed limit, a speed limit of 30 kilometers an hour where appropriate in residential areas. I know they do that in Ontario. And of course, that too would impact the number of points and how that is addressed by the House. The sections, there are many ways though, and I think this is what we need to understand with what 4 points can mean to somebody, where they may get a ticket and not worry about it because it's 2 points. And then they may just accumulate these over time. We the minister for, or the member for Cape Breton North implied that he's had a few run-ins, I guess, where maybe he was on his way very quickly to places and may have accumulated some points. Of course, he would never drive to the left of the center line, I'm sure. We're not allowed, which would only get him 2 points. Now, I'm intrigued by one of the ones that you can get under Section 181, which is operating a motor vehicle without adequate brakes. And I have to assume that you only get 2 points for that because you probably don't end up too well once they figure out that you're operating your motor vehicle without adequate brakes. Mr. Speaker, failing to obey traffic signs or signals or yield the right-of-way, which we see examples of all the time if it's caught, is of course also just 2 points. There's a number of offences which yield 2 points. Offences involving motor vehicles under Section